a fantastic autumnal image that you would like to turn into watercolour, but you are lacking the confidence with your watercolour skills and don't know what colours to use, in today's tutorial I'll be using 2 reference images to create a watercolour step by step, showing you what colours and what techniques you will need to use so that you will have the confidence to create your own autumnal watercolour scene. The 2 images that I am using today are from Pixabay and Unsplash, and the links to both of the images are in the descriptions below. You will also find links in the descriptions below to all of the resources that I have used in today's tutorials, including the paper and the paintbrushes and the watercolours. I would particularly focus on the paintbrushes because of the type of paintbrushes that I have used on the image on the left, which is the leaves, and I will speak to you in more detail about that later. So let's get on with the tutorial. So the first thing to mention about this image that I'm painting is the fact that I'm painting on watercolour paper made by Arches, descriptions in the links below, and that it is a cold pressed paper because I want it to be able to hold the water. I'll be using a wet on wet technique, and that I have sketched out the image. When I'm applying the clean water, you will notice that I am avoiding the bark and the branch area, and that is because I want to make sure that I am controlling those areas, and I will be applying the paint to those areas later. So I studied the image before I started painting, and I wanted to plan this out so that I had a blurry area in the background to reflect the depth of field. And when I say depth of field, I mean that you have certain areas of the painting that are blurry and certain areas that are in focus. So the bark on the left hand side is blurry, the background is blurry, and you have the leaves in focus, and I want that to be the main focus of my painting. So because of that, I started with the area in the background that is leaves, but it's going to be very different than the leaves that are in the foreground. So you'll notice that I've applied a lot of water, and then we have this very watery effect in the background. That is to reflect the depth of field, and it's not a usual effect that I would create, but I wanted to create that blurry effect that you would have on a camera if you're taking a photograph and it was out of focus. The colours that I have applied in this section are cadmium yellow, gombrich hue and cadmium red. I also applied a tiny bit of sap green to some areas to lift out tiny elements of green leaves. So before I start moving on to the second image, I'm just going to block in a few extra branches on the first image. I have already studied the second image and I have an idea of what I'm going to do, so I'm going to focus on the main tree. You will notice that when you look at the compositions of the landscape images, I am focusing on one area and I've cropped them down. That's just so that I can fit them in this portrait composition area. So you won't have all of the images in. Obviously, when you do your own images, that's up to you. So I'm sketching in the basic trunk and some of the branches. I'm not including all of them because I'll add those in later. And if you haven't already seen the Winsor & Newton review, I would advise that you check that out, because all of the paints that I'm using in today's tutorial are from that Winsor & Newton Cotman set. So it might be worth you checking that out at some point before you start painting. And also it has on that review the silver black velvet paintbrushes that I am using in today's tutorial. They are very useful for getting details, so it might be worth you watching that review. I'm just going to put a card in the description above. So I'm now sketching in the tree trunks in the background. Just keep your details very basic, because obviously you can't add many details, and also keep your sketches quite light. So now I'm adding the paint. I'm not going to do wet on wet for this particular image, for the simple reason that I want to have some control over my paint, and I want to make sure it doesn't go onto the actual trunk itself. So I've made a very watery mix of sap green here to begin with, to make up for the greenery behind the main leaves, which are the orange leaves. So I'm putting that in first, and then I'm putting some more green on top. This is Hooker's green. As I say, all these paints are in that Cotman set, the £45 set. If you want to see the review, the card is above. And then we have cadmium yellow and cadmium orange. And we blend that whilst it's wet. So all there is to add now to this background is a very watery mix of cerulean blue and a watery mix of raw umber. So we're now going back into the leaf image. So for this particular task I'm going to be using a Royal and Langnickel brushes, and you can find the link for these in the description below. And I'm going to be using some particular colours. So the first one is cadmium yellow and Gombage hue, and that is from the Winsor & Newton Cotman set, which I spoke about earlier, and the links for that is also in the descriptions below. So I'm going to start building up the yellow leaves. So I would suggest whatever reference image you're using, it doesn't necessarily have to be this one, it could be another one. Start with your lightest areas first. Whenever you're working with watercolour, you should start with your lightest areas first, and bear in mind that when you are painting, the colours will always come up lighter, so you need to bear that in mind also when you are planning your image and starting to block your colours in. A layer of clean water because I'm going to apply the wet on wet technique, and I'm going to add some areas of cadmium orange to represent the leaves, and I'm going for quite a loose feel, and this is why I'm adding the wet on wet technique. I'm then going to use tissue to take out areas of white for the sky, and I'm leaving areas of green for the areas behind for the green trees. So we're back to image one, the image of the leaves, and as I mentioned before, my main focus for this image was making sure that the leaves in the foreground were really sharp and they're the main focus, and that everything else was blurry. That effect is called depth of field. Now, because of that, I mentioned that I wanted to use these particular brushes. These are the Royal and Langnickel brushes. Obviously the other brushes are available, but these ones, the links in the description below, and I found them very useful for getting a clean edge. These can also be used with acrylic paints. So initially on this next stage I started adding cadmium orange and cadmium red, looking for those leaves, also making sure the angles are correct. I wasn't just randomly adding these shapes, I was looking very carefully at the angles so that I could get a realistic effect. Also, one thing to mention is that when you are adding these areas, make sure that your paper surface is completely dry. If it's wet, then you will get watercolour blooms similar to the ones that are in the background, but I wanted that effect because I wanted that blurry effect, whereas now I want a crisp, clean line, so that's why I had to wait for the paper to be completely dry. And just to let you know, the brushes that I've used for these leaves are size 4 for the smaller leaves and then size 14 for the larger leaves to achieve that chiselled effect. So I'm now going to move on to the image of the tree on the right hand side, and I'm going to start adding darker leaves now to give the image more depth. So I will be using cadmium red pale to bring out those darker areas. So now I will pick out areas on the ground with cadmium orange, and I will add an area of sap green. So now with the size 4 brush, I'm going to apply clean water to the brush marks to soften them, and then I will be taking a viewfinder, which is a small piece of paper, to identify the colour that I need for the next layer. You can cut any size of paper to any viewfinder size, and I decided that I would use burnt sienna for this next section. So again, with the size 4 brush, I have decided to add burnt sienna, but I waited for the paper to dry a little before I started adding that, because I didn't want the watercolour to bloom and to spread out. So that was the next layer. If you are finding today's tutorial useful, why not subscribe and hit the bell to be notified of more content. So after I have added the details on the right hand side, I'm going to now focus on the tree bark of the trunk of the tree in the foreground in the image with the leaves. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I wanted to focus on the depth of field, so the blurry areas and the focused areas. And on this tree, what I started to do was add lines up and down the trunk in Van Dyke brown, and then I applied clean water. I decided not to use wet on wet because I wanted to control the brush strokes and make sure that we didn't have watercolour blooms going in between. I wanted to make sure that it was a really clean effect. So I added a really minimal amount of water to make sure that I was getting the blurry effect, yet not getting blooms. And I'm really happy with how this has turned out. I also used a size 4 brush. So now I'm adding detailing to the small branches with a size 0 brush, because this detail is really minute. And I'm also adding the back trunk, the more narrow trunk, and again this is with a size 0 brush. I'm now also using a size 2 brush on the right hand side image, and I'm using Van Dyke brown for the trees in the background. So I'm also carrying on adding detailing to the foreground with Van Dyke brown, and carrying on with the smaller branches now that the other ones have dried with the size 0 brush. So now I'm picking out highlights and small details with this white gel pen. I could do this with gouache, but because the details are really fine, I find the gel pen is much easier. I'm now going to add Indian red in small leaf-like strokes to represent the fallen leaves. I will also now pick out areas of the forest floor and of the tree bark with sepia, as this is a darker brown, so it will pick up all of those darker tones. final finishing touch, I'm going to apply black watercolour pencil rather than paint and blend this over with some clean water. The reason for this is it adds a softer feel rather than the black watercolour paint, which can sometimes be quite harsh. Overall, I'm really pleased with how both images turned out. My first image, the focus was achieving the depth of field effect, and I do feel that this was successful, especially with achieving the sharpness of the leaves. This image is the one that I was concerned about halfway through. When I was looking at it, I honestly thought it wasn't going to go well, but then when I started adding the brown of the tree trunk, it started to come to life. And again, like the other one, I am actually really pleased with this one. If you found this tutorial useful, make sure you check out the watercolour playlist, where you will find more tutorials that will improve your watercolour skills. Don't forget that the links to all the resources used in today's tutorial are in the description below, and if you would like to see more tutorials like this, please make sure that you hit the subscribe button and hit the bell to be notified of future content. I would also love to see your autumnal paintings or drawings, so if you manage to produce any that you are really proud of, please make sure you send them to @Spectrum Art Academy and they can be put on display there.